Good morning. It's about time to begin our Bible class this morning. Good to see everybody here. Before we begin this morning, we'll have a word of prayer. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, so grateful for this day you blessed us with, Father, this Lord's Day, and the opportunity we have to assemble together this morning, Father, and grateful for this Bible class hour. We can come together, Father, and study your word and learn from it, Father, and pray as we study your word this morning that we can study with open minds and open hearts and be good stewards of your word, Father, and pray we'll always be good stewards of your word and spend the time in study, Father, that we need to better learn what our duties are to you and to be better Christians every day and in the future than we have in the past, Father. And pray for your forgiveness for any sins and missed in our life and over a few many we sin each day. Just pray for your blessing upon us, Father, and help us to just be better every day, Father. And thankful for those that have come back that have been sick, Father. Pray for your continued blessings upon those that are continue to be out, be sick, Father, and pray for your blessings upon them. They can get better to be your will. And pray for your continued blessings upon this congregation, Father, and pray for your blessings upon us as we go into this Bible class hour. Pray for your blessings upon us as we go into the worship hour here shortly, Father, as well. Pray everything we do is done and pleasing in your sight, Father, in Jesus' name. Amen. So we're continuing our study, Matthew chapter 23 this morning. Jesus continues his woes unto the scribes and Pharisees. So this morning we'll start with woe number 3 in verse 15, what we're calling evil proselytizing. So to me, in my opinion, this woe is particularly interesting because it gives a little bit of insight, I think, into some specific insight into the works of the scribes and Pharisees and kind of what they were doing. So remember, back in verses 1 through 12 of this chapter, Jesus gives some general rebukes of the scribes and Pharisees and rebukes them for seeking the glory of men, that all the works that they do are done so that they can be seen of men. So I think that what we'll see with verse 15, this woe number 3 hits right at the heart of that. Everything they're doing is to be seen, for their works to be seen of men. So Matthew chapter 23, verse 15 says, Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you compass sea and land to make one proselyte, and when he is made, you make him twofold more the child of hell than yourselves. So as we look at this, I think that it's beneficial for us to get a brief understanding, a brief of the Jewish proselytizing and kind of some of the things they did, how they viewed it, how they looked at it, and even a brief history of the methods of the time and preceding the first century, the time immediately preceding the first century. I think it's extremely beneficial for our study, to gain a better understanding of what this woe is actually referencing. But a proselyte, for a Jewish proselyte, so when Jesus says, refers to the proselytes, it's literally means a stranger or a newcomer. It would be somebody who has come over from a Gentile religion into Judaism. So somebody that's basically converted into Judaism, that was not born a Jew. They were generally divided into two classes of proselytes. There's some discussion, there's some disagreement, I guess, amongst scholars about how much that the classes actually did anything more than just being theoretical. Some argue that it was just a theoretical classification, that it didn't actually do much in everyday life. Others have suggested that there is some evidence that there was at least some distinction between Gentiles, those that are still truly Gentiles, and then the Jews and the proselytes being lumped together, which would be the proselytes of righteousness. The proselytes of the gate are still technically, in a sense, Gentiles, we could say. That's what we'll look at one of the things we'll look at this morning. But the proselytes of righteousness, they received circumcision. So these were proselytes who basically took on the whole Mosaic law, all the forms and they were agreed to be bound by the entire Mosaic law. So they took on circumcision. They bound themselves to keep the whole Mosaic law, and they complied with all the requirements of Judaism. The proselytes of the gate, on the other hand, were a little bit less strict, I guess you could say. They dwelt among the Jews, lived among the Jews, but they did not receive circumcision, for one. And it said that they observed what they called the 7 precepts of Noah, which was idolatry, blasphemy, homicide, unchastity, theft, rebellion against rulers, and the use of flesh with blood. And so the idea being that they didn't take on a wholesale adoption of the Jewish law like the proselytes of righteousness did, but they more so took on, adopted the moral law, I guess you could say, of the Jewish religion. They abided by at least these 7 precepts, and they kept themselves from committing these 7 sins, but they didn't take on the entire Mosaic law. It was more so an adoption of the moral law, I guess you could say. But that seems to be the biggest difference between the two. The proselytes of the gate were sometimes called God-fearers. There's some reference to that. That we can see. Some would suggest that this would be potentially the class of people that Cornelius would have belonged to in Acts chapter 10. Nobody knows that for sure. Just some have suggested that would be he could have belonged to the proselytes of the gate. But so the term proselytes of the gate comes from Exodus chapter 20 and verse 10. Comes from a couple. There's several passages that say basically the same thing, but 2 would be from Exodus chapter 20 verse 10, then one from Deuteronomy. Exodus 20 verse 10 says, "But the 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work, thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, nor thy stranger that is within thy gates." And then Deuteronomy chapter 5 verse 14 says, "But the 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work, thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, nor thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thine ox, nor thine ass, nor any of thy cattle, nor thy stranger that is within thy gates, that thy manservant and thy maidservants may rest as well as thou." So this is where the term proselyte of the gates come from, that they're still generally considered as strangers in the land, where this references strangers that are within the gates. So they dwelt among the Jews, but they didn't necessarily take on the entire Mosaic law. Referencing Cornelius in Acts chapter 10 verse 2, he's referred to as a devout man, the one that feared God with all his house, which gave much alms to the people and prayed to God always. So again, it's suggested that Cornelius might have been a proselyte of the gate, is what they refer to. Anyways, there was a lot of turmoil in the area of Judea in the 1st and 2nd century BC, so the first 100, 200 years before Christ was born. There was a significant amount of turmoil in the area, and then just prior to the 1st century is when it comes under Roman rule, and then things sort of die down a little bit, and it actually brings a little bit of stability to the area. But just to get this all actually ties in pretty well, I think, to our lesson this morning, to Matthew chapter 23 and verse 15. But just to give sort of a brief history account of what's going on at this time. So in the 2nd century BC, Judea lay between the Ptolemaic kingdom, which was based in Egypt, and the Seleucid Empire, which was based in Syria. Monarchies which had formed following the death of Alexander the Great. So after Alexander the Great died, his kingdom, I guess his territories were sort of taken over, or these leaders arose up for these empires, these kingdoms. So Judea had initially come under Ptolemaic rule, but fell to the Seleucids around 200 BC. Judah at that time had been affected by the Hellenization initiated by Alexander the Great, so that's basically the Greek culture. Anytime the term the Hellenist or Hellenization, it always refers to Greek, so this is basically the Greek culture coming in. Some Jews, mainly those of the upper urban class, notably the Tobiad family, wished to dispense with Jewish law and to adopt a Greek lifestyle. According to the historian Victor, I'm not going to try to say his last name, the main motive for the Tobiads' Hellenism was economic and political. The Hellenizing Jews built a gymnasium in Jerusalem, competed in international Greek games, removed their marks of circumcision, and repudiated the Holy Covenant. So the historian Josephus mentions this, removing the marks of circumcision, and actually it was actually something that the Jews would do because those that played in the gymnasium played naked. They didn't have any clothes on. So it was obviously circumcision was something of the Jews, when generally the people outside the Jewish nation were not circumcised. So the Jews felt pressured, I guess peer pressure you could say, but some actually undertook, there was a surgery or modification, I guess plastic surgery, similar to what we'd call plastic surgery today, that would remove the marks of circumcision or make them appear uncircumcised, so that they could, play in the gymnasium in the games with the Greeks and appear more like the Greeks. Josephus mentions that in some of his writings. But you can see the Greek culture taking over, their being influenced, and actually some wanted to do away with the Jewish covenant totally. So then Antiochus, there's a guy named Antiochus IV Epiphanes. He became the ruler of the Seleucid Empire in 175 BC, and then he attacks Jerusalem in 168 BC. So we'll talk about him a little bit more in depth when we get into Matthew 24. Actually, we'll reference him in our study of Matthew 24. We'll actually reference some of Daniel, and then Daniel's going to reference some of the ruler of the Seleucid Empire, Antiochus IV Epiphanes. So we're going to study a little bit more detail in Matthew 24, sort of his oppression of the Jews and some of the things he did when he attacked the Jews. But just for now, I think this is a quote from Josephus. I think this gives a suitable summary of kind of the relationship between Antiochus, the Seleucid Empire, and the Jews or the area of Judea. So now Antiochus was not satisfied either with his unexpected taking the city of Jerusalem. He had sieged and taken Jerusalem, or with its pillage, or with the great slaughter he had made there. But being overcome with his violent passions and remembering what he had suffered during the siege, he compelled the Jews to dissolve the laws of their country and to keep their infants uncircumcised and to sacrifice swine's flesh upon the altar, against which they all opposed themselves, and the most approved among them were put to death. So Antiochus' goal is basically to abolish the Jewish law there in Jerusalem. But he takes over the Seleucid Empire and then sieges Jerusalem, takes Jerusalem, and we'll look in Daniel, when we get into Daniel, Matthew chapter 24, that there's a period of time that the daily sacrifices are taken away, and it's generally taken to be during the reign of Antiochus IV. But so the Jews revolt against Antiochus IV. They set up what's called the Hasmonean dynasty. It begins with a man named John Hyrcanus, who served as leader of the nation, and as high priest in 134 BC. So then he begins to assert some Judean independence around the time. He issues a military campaign. At this time, the Antiochus IV has had, his empire is in some turmoil itself. So the Jews and the Hasmonean dynasty take advantage of this. John Hyrcanus begins a military campaign. He conquers Samaria, and then after he conquers Samaria, he forces those that are non-Jews in that area to adopt Jewish customs. So this is like a forced conversion, or at least maybe not a full-on conversion, but he at least forces them to adopt some customs. So he binds these Jewish customs onto the non-Jewish people, which is something you haven't really seen up to this point right in Jewish history. So then After conquering Samaria, he continues. He conquered the nation of Idumea, which is basically Edom, the same people of Edom. And then when he conquers this people, he offers them the choice of death, exile, or circumcision. So he goes even further in regards to the forced conversions with them, and that he binds, ultimately circumcision upon them. His son was a man named Aristobulus the first. He succeeds John Hyrcanus, and then he actually established a Jewish monarchy. So this was the first time the Jews had a monarch since, about the 483 years since they returned from Babylon. So I struggle with his name. Aristobulus the first established a monarchy, and then he claimed both the throne as king and the title of high priest. So his claim to high priest enraged the Pharisees, and they actually revolted against him. They didn't like his claim to both king and high priest, but he only ruled for a year or two. So he ended up, the revolt didn't do very much in the grand scheme. He ended up dying before the revolt could amount to anything. But it enraged the Pharisees. As we know, the Pharisees would be one of the more strict adherents to the law. For the Jewish sect, more strict to the adherence of the law. But so then Aristobulus conquers what's called the Iturian territory, offered them the same, made the same offer to them that his father did. He offered them death, exile, or circumcision. So again, this brings us up to about this monarchy lasted to about 37 BC, which is about the time that the Herodian dynasty, so King Herod, the King Herods began taking over, which are aligned with the Roman government. So about this time, the territory of Judea begins falling under Roman rule. The Jewish monarchy, Hasmonean dynasty, is sort of dissolved, and then things end up being a little bit more quiet and calm and peaceful. You don't have all this conquering and all this stuff going on, but so I think it's worthwhile going through this information just because we can see that in the time immediately preceding the first century, when Jesus is telling the scribes and Pharisees here in the first century, immediately preceding this time, you've got proselytes being gained by military might, and we have these forced conversions, forced circumcision upon groups of conquered people. And obviously this is something that's would be new to Judaism, not something that was practiced before this, and obviously not something that was commanded of by God to forcefully proselyte nations into Judaism. Smith's Bible commentary says, or Bible dictionary says, where force was not in their power, they obtained their ends by the most unscrupulous methods of fraud. Those who were the most active in proselytizing were precisely those whose teaching had departed from all that was true and living. The vials of the Jews were grafted on the vices of the heathen. So, basically what we're saying, or what they're saying here, is that there was no love for lost souls as the motivation for the proselytizing. So the scribes and Pharisees, during the first century, immediately preceding the first century, there was any motivation other than love of lost souls, or the concern for your fellow man, or desire to do God's will and to spread Judaism around, or anything like that. The plan, the motivation was always military might, or the desire to take these lands, take these people, resources and money and all that would go along with that, and then also the desire to be seen of men, which is from the first century scribes and Pharisees, we'll really see is their motivation. But I think it's interesting if you see just prior to this time how the proselytizing of the Jewish nation was done. It was done by military might, which is something that was obviously not commanded by God, something that was new. It really, the Jewish nation had never seen before that. But again, there was no love for lost souls. We think about the scribes, Pharisees of the first century. So when Jesus tells them, they can pass land and sea to make one proselyte, why are they doing this? Well, there was no, it was all for selfish gain, right? This is what Jesus accused them of. So I think it's interesting because there was no command of Moses to do these evangelism type efforts, right? To go out and bring people in to Judaism. There's no command of the law of Moses that commanded them to do that. We actually see that, remember that God had commanded the Jews to, number one, drive out the people of the land. They were not supposed to intermarry with the people of the land of Canaan when they took that land. They were not supposed to, allow these people in because the temptation would be there for them to pull them away from God and go to idols and all those things, which we see that's exactly what happened. It was due to the fact that they intermarried and didn't drive the people out of the land and associated with these foreign nations that caused the children of Israel to fall into the sin of idolatry and then eventually be taken into Babylonian and Assyrian captivities. So, there was no law established that said evangelism as we would view evangelism today, which was to bring people into Judaism. Not to say that people couldn't become proselytes and come into Judaism, but the goal was not evangelism efforts like we have today in the first century church. But so now they're reaching out to the Gentiles. The goal is for the Jews, the scribes, Pharisees to reach out to the Gentiles and to bring proselytes in. Jesus says they can pass land and sea in order to make one proselyte. So the implication here is it's all about me, right? It's not necessarily that they have a love for lost souls or the fellow man. They're doing it because they believe it's God's will. The goal is to be seen of men. So it's all about, look how far I've traveled, or look what I've done, look what I've suffered for making these proselytes. Look how many proselytes I have made. It's all due for their own glory, not for the glory of God, not in order to follow God's will. It's all to be seen of men. So some commentators also note that the quote-unquote evangelism efforts, most of them were focused toward bringing the proselytes of the gate into as proselytes of righteousness. So that the significant amount of evangelism was just to bring those that were amongst them, living with the Jews, dwelling among the Jews, and just bringing them over so that they practice all of the Mosaic law, which the scribes and Pharisees we've looked at quite a bit. Especially the Pharisees, they heavily favored the ritual aspects of the law, the physical aspects of the law, with all the washings and all the things that went along with that. So it seems that their goal was just to get people to come to that side, which would be sort of a reflection of their own view of religion. So it wasn't necessarily that that there was something wrong per se with the proselytes of the gate. It was that the whole purpose of the scribes and Pharisees was to get as many adherents to their own particular view of religion than any other. It seems to be another aspect of the motivation there. But all that to say, I think we can make two distinctions here in verse number 15 that sort of serve as the justification for the woe that Jesus is given here in verse number 15. Number one, the proselytes were made out of selfish motivations in order to receive the praise and glory of men. So it wasn't about anything about lost souls or what's right or what's wrong. It was generally based on the fact that the scribes and the Pharisees wanted to gain proselytes, or travel great distances to gain proselytes solely to build up themselves, and to receive this glory of men. Second, the proselytes were made to the scribes and Pharisees' particular religious view, and not necessarily as true followers of God. So the goal of the proselytizing wasn't that here's someone who's not following God's will. I'm concerned about his soul, and I want to show him the right way. Instead, it was, let's bring as many people into the Pharisees or the scribes, which a lot of the scribes might have been Pharisees. Let's bring as many people into my particular view of religion as possible. There was a lot of disagreement between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and this sort of fits into that, I think. Let me get as many people that fit my specific view of religion, not for any other reason. Not because I think they'll be better off, not because I'm concerned about their salvation, strictly because this is going to make me look better, make me feel better, and it's going to make my, my group even bigger. I'm about to chew this peppermint up before I drool everywhere. So I think those are two distinctions we can make about what Jesus says about evil proselytizing and why was the proselytizing evil to begin with. Second, we can see that Jesus tells them that their proselytes are twofold more the child of hell than themselves. The term or the term twofold literally means double. Jesus is telling them, you make a proselyte and he's twice the child of hell than you are. So the word child used here is used about 61 times in the New Testament, and it can mean several things based upon its use and the actual context of the use. It can, in some instances, be a metaphorical sense, expressing prominent moral characteristics, which I think is the usage here in Matthew 23 verse 15. So its usage in this verse means one who depends on another or is his follower, one who is worthy of a thing or of the destiny that corresponds with the character, whether your character is evil or good. So it could be evil. The same word is used in John chapter 17, verse 12, for another evil application. And then in Luke 30 or 20, verse 36, we'll look at those verses in a minute. But what Jesus is saying is that the scribes and Pharisees are worthy of punishment, or they're destined for punishment because of their evil character. Their character and the motivation for proselytizing is evil. It goes back to their love of the praise of men. Has nothing to do with love of lost souls or anything of that nature. But the word, it's a little bit. I guess it's a little bit difficult when we see the word child to mean something, for whom a thing is destined. But you get the point here in John chapter 17, verse 12. This is Jesus speaking, referencing Judas. While I was with them in the world, I kept them in thy name. Those that thou gavest me I have kept, and none of them is lost, but the son of perdition, that the scripture might be fulfilled. So this was a reference to child as for whom a thing is destined. Jesus references that the scripture might be fulfilled, for Judas to commit, the crime that he did against Jesus. And then Luke chapter 20, verse 36, we actually looked at this verse a few lessons back. It says, neither can they die anymore, for they are equal unto the angels, and are the children of God, being the children of the resurrection. So the word child here is referencing, think about something you're worthy of or being destined for. Child is sharers in the resurrection. So when Jesus says, makes them twofold more the child of hell than yourselves, Jesus is telling them that, number one, the scribes and Pharisees are worthy of punishment, worthy of destined for punishment in hell because of their evil character. But then also the proselytes that they're making, they're spending all this energy making these proselytes, and then they end up making them twice the son of hell than themselves. So we talked about, I think it was last week. It was verse 14. Last week we talked about the term greater damnation, because Jesus uses the term greater damnation for the scribes and Pharisees, saying that they will receive the greater damnation. In verse number 14 of Matthew 23, we talked about how the term greater damnation does not reference degrees of punishment or degrees of reward, because we know there are no degrees of punishment, nor are there any degrees of reward. All the wicked people receive the same punishment, and all the righteous people receive the same reward, being either heaven or hell. But the idea of the greater damnation comes from more so levels of judgment, I guess you could say, meaning that you're held accountable for the offices that you have, or the things that you teach. For example, teachers are going to be held to a certain judgment for the things that they teach. We talked about elders are going to be held accountable for the leadership that they provide. You think about husbands; they're going to be held accountable for the homes that they preside over, that sort of thing. So when you use the term greater damnation, the idea could be harsher judgment or more abundant judgment, in that you have another level of judgment, because obviously if you're not a teacher, then you're not going to be held to the standard of what you teach. But if you teach, that's a judgment that you're going to be stand before God and give an account to. Same as an elder. If you're an elder, you're going to stand before God and give an account on your eldership. And if you were an apostle, you would stand before God and give an account for your apostleship. So we talked about that last week. That's similar to kind of what's being said here this morning, when Jesus tells them that makes them twofold more the child of hell. It's not that you can be twice the child of hell than anybody else. It's not a degree of punishment or anything like that. But I think what Jesus is saying is that the scribes and Pharisees have a religion that's based upon, at some level, it's based upon God's Word. They've since profaned their religion to the point that Jesus calls them traditions of men. They're following the traditions of men. So the scribes and Pharisees have a religion that they've profaned their actions and their motivations and their desires and their works so much that they've left what's actually the will of God, actually the true religion of God, or true religion of Judaism, I guess. And now they more or less practice their own religion. So the proselytes that they're making, they're not making proselytes to Judaism. They're making proselytes to Phariseeism. They're making proselytes to their own view of religion, their own particular view of religion. That's why Jesus says they're twice the child of hell, because they didn't even start with Judaism. They're starting with your perverted version of Judaism, and going from there. So that's the idea I think we can see when Jesus says they're twice the child of hell, twofold more the child of hell. In that respect, the proselytes are worse than the teachers in that regard, right? So now the proselytes, if they're bringing in other proselytes, they're going to start with where the Pharisees are, and maybe where they are in their particular view of Phariseeism or Judaism. Nobody's bringing them nobody's proselyting people into the true religion of Judaism. It's all about where their particular view of it stands. So I think that's what Jesus is saying when he says twofold more the child of hell. So then I think we all understand what hell is when we hear the term hell in the Bible, or we hear when Jesus says, you make him twofold more the child of hell. I think we all understand the implication there and what that means, the punishment, the future state of punishment and all that. But I think that the word hell has an interesting definition. I think it helps me understand the seriousness of what's of the woe that Jesus has given the scribes and Pharisees here. The word hell means actually the valley of the son of lamentation, or the sons of lamentation. Seems kind of odd to me right off the bat when you read the word hell that's the definition, valley of the son of lamentation. This is what's referenced actually in Jeremiah 7 verse 31, where Tophet here means place of fire and Hinnom means lamentation. So Jeremiah 7 verse 31 says they have built the high places of Tophet, which means place of fire, which is in the valley of the son of Hinnom. The word Hinnom there means lamentation. to burn their sons and their daughters in the fire, which I commanded them not, neither came it into my heart. So we covered this, a while back in our study of Jeremiah, but this is the children of Israel are sacrificing their children to the god Moloch, who was a false god, and it was in the shape of a bull, the form of a bull. But the idea being that the idol would be red hot, or there'd be a fire built inside or around the idol, and the arms would be fiery hot, and the people would lay their children on the fiery idol and sacrifice their children to this idol, Moloch. God is saying, this is not something I commanded them to do. Neither ever it came into my heart, but this is something that they did. So, but it's interesting that the places of Tophet mean places of fire, and then the valley of the son of Hinnom is the valley of the son of lamentation. Actually, the Hebrew word for valley of Hinnom is translated Gehenna. So I think most of us recognize that word, the word Gehenna. Generally, we use that for hell, or that's a word that is used for hell. Gehenna is a transliterated Hebrew word for valley of Hinnom. And Gehenna is actually the name of a valley on the south and east side of Jerusalem, which was so called for the cries of the little children who were thrown into the fiery arms of Moloch. So if you think about this whole idea of this comes from the fact that the children of Israel were sacrificing their children to a false god, literally sacrificing their children to a false god. That's why it became known as the valley of the son of Hinnom, or the valley of the sons of lamentation. And then again, Gehenna is just a transliterated Hebrew word for that. So the Jews so abhorred this place after it was cleaned up. So the Jews so abhorred the place after these horrible sacrifices had been abolished by King Josiah that they cast into it not only all manner of refuse, but even the dead bodies of animals and of unburied criminals who had been executed. And since fires were always needed to consume the dead bodies, that the air might not become tainted with the putrefaction, it came to pass that the place was called Hell of Fire, or Gehenna of Fire. And the name was transferred to that place in Hades. Later on in the New Testament, the name was transferred to that place in Hades, where the wicked after death will be punished. That's kind of where we get the term hell, Gehenna, applied to the New Testament. This area around Jerusalem where they burnt the dead bodies of animals and humans, and through all their waste. It was in one sense an everlasting fire, because the fire was always burning. The idea of that area, that the valley of Hinnom, the area of Gehenna, was transferred into our understanding of the region, or I guess the portion of Hades, the realm of the dead, where the wicked go and are punished. So Jesus is telling them here, the scribes and Pharisees, that not only are they destined to go to Gehenna, not only are they destined for that punishment, but they're worthy of that punishment. They deserve this punishment. They deserve to go to this place for what they're doing, for their evil proselytizing. I don't know about you, but it's a chilling description to me, at least, of what can be expected in the eternal hell. When we see what was given here in the valley of Hinnom, it's a chilling description to me to think about, the application of that to the eternal hell. And for Jesus to tell the scribes and Pharisees that their actions, works, cause them to be worthy of inheriting this place, is a sobering thought as well. So I think it's one thing to go there, I guess. It's bad enough to go there, or in general, but it's something else entirely, I think, to be told by the Son of God that not only are you going there, but you deserve to go there. Your actions, things that you're doing, have destined you to go there, and you're worthy of that level of punishment. I think that's a sobering thought, and a good lesson for us today is that beware of evil proselytizing. Beware of false teachers. It's really, the lesson is as simple as that, in that beware of false teachers. It's important for us to understand God's Word, what God requires of us. God has given us His written Word, so it's our responsibility to study it for ourselves and understand those things, um, because the destiny or the worthiness of being in eternal hell would be the same for false teachers today as it would be for the scribes and Pharisees in the first century. So when Jesus tells them they were worthy of that place, false teachers today and false teachers between the first century and now, and from now until the end of time, you could make the application and say the same thing to them, that you're worthy of the same place because of their evil proselytizing. Now maybe it's for different reasons, there's maybe not necessarily the same motivations of the scribes and Pharisees, but we can see the importance of understanding the whether or not the person that you're following is a false teacher. It's our responsibility to do that. Any questions or comments on that portion before we move on? I got one more point. I know we got a few minutes. I hadn't heard the first bell, so maybe we got 5 or 6 minutes. Any questions on or comments on what we've talked about up to this point? All right, so I think it would be an injustice to this lesson, or from woe number 3 here around evil proselytizing, if we did not review the significant contrast between Matthew 23 and verse 15 and then the beatitude given in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 9. So, again, Matthew 23 verse 15 says, "Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you can pass sea and land to make one proselyte, and when he is made, you make him twofold more the child of hell than yourself." Matthew 5 and verse 9 says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God." So we can see a contrast between child of hell and child of God. Jesus tells the scribes and Pharisees what they're doing makes them to be a child of hell. The scribes and Pharisees, and by extension their proselytes, had an extremely poor moral character. That's the basis of the word child there. Child of hell is based upon their extremely poor moral character. Their character was, for the most part, completely devoid of righteousness. Their proselytizing was evil because it was completely devoid of righteousness. And that's why Jesus tells them that they're sons of hell, and their proselytes are sons of hell, because of their extreme poor moral character and the fact that they're devoid of righteousness. On the other hand, Jesus tells us in Matthew 5, verse 9, that the peacemakers shall be called the children of God, or they shall be called sons of God. So we see this significant contrast between being a son of hell and being a son of God. So what do you have to do in order to be a son of God? Jesus says you have to be a peacemaker. So what does it mean to be a peacemaker? I think the book of James chapter 3 gives an excellent commentary on this. We'll close really with this passage, but James chapter 3, verses 13 through 18 says, "Who is a wise man and endued with knowledge among you? Let him show out of a good conversation his works with meekness of wisdom. But if you have bitter envying and strife in your hearts, glory not, and lie not against the truth. This wisdom descendeth not from above, but is earthly, sensual, devilish. For where envying and strife is, there is confusion and every evil work. But the wisdom that is from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, and easy to be entreated, full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality and without hypocrisy. And the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace of them that make peace." So I think that if we want to understand what it means to be a peacemaker, James chapter 3 lays it out for us. The fruit of righteousness is sown in peace of them that make peace. Everything that's mentioned here in James chapter 3 is the opposite of what the Pharisees were doing. Think about it that way. The scribes and Pharisees were not pure. They were not peaceable and gentle. They were not full of mercy and good fruits. They were not without partiality, and they were especially not without hypocrisy. If you want to make a contrast between child of hell and son of God, child of God, if you just did the opposite of what the scribes and Pharisees did, that'd get you pretty close, I think. But I think James chapter 3 really lays out the idea here. What does it mean to be a peacemaker? That's all I've got this morning for our lesson. Woe number 3. So anybody got any questions or comments before we close this morning? All right, thank y'all.